Have you ever found yourself scrolling through the news late at night, reading about the latest global crisis or some unprecedented natural disaster, and thought to yourself, well, that's it?
We had a good run.
Right, exactly. We had a good run, but the world is definitely ending.
I think we've all been there.
Yeah. And if you have, you are absolutely not alone. In fact, you're participating in one of the oldest psychological traditions in human history. Welcome to today's deep dive.
We are taking a massive, fascinating, and honestly sometimes slightly terrifying stack of sources today to explore this incredibly persistent human obsession with the apocalypse and the end times.
It is a topic that spans thousands of years, and the materials we're drawing from really reflect that incredible scope.
We're looking through a stack that includes historical theology papers, a really insightful Reddit Ask Historians thread analyzing the Black Death, a 2025 blog post from the Center for Political Studies on Modern Political Disengagement.
Which is fascinating, by the way.
Oh, totally. And we also have an article from the magazine Modern Reformation and a classic, groundbreaking 1956 psychology book by Leon Festinger called When Prophecy Fails.
So the mission for this deep dive is to figure out exactly how humans throughout history have interpreted these end-of-the-world prophecies. We want to understand how these beliefs actually shape our psychology and our political behavior right now, today.
And perhaps most intriguingly, we want to look at what happens to everyday people when the world stubbornly refuses to end on schedule.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the word apocalypse itself. Because when you hear that word, you probably picture meteors or zombies or nuclear fallout.
Total fiery destruction.
Exactly. But looking at the historical context in our sources, that is not what the word originally meant at all, is it?
Not even close.
Yeah.
The modern Hollywood definition has completely hijacked the original meaning.
Right.
The word comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, which actually translates to an unveiling or a stripping away of a veil. Yeah. In its original context, an apocalypse isn't about destroying the planet. It's a literary genre about revealing hidden spiritual and political realities to the reader. It is supposed to pull back the curtain on the universe so you can see who is really pulling the strings.
See, that definition completely changes how you read the most famous apocalyptic text in history, the Book of Revelation.
It really does.
Because it's traditionally attributed to John of Patmos, and it's often viewed today as this chaotic collection of terrifying hallucinations. But looking through the theological papers in our stack, scholars who study its architecture say it is anything but random.
No, it's a meticulously structured literary blueprint built heavily on the number 7.
You have the 7 churches, the 7 seals.
7 trumpets and the 7 bowls.
Exactly. But the most interesting part to me is how we're actually supposed to read that timeline.
And that is where so many modern readers get tripped up, instead of reading it as a straight linear timeline.
Like a history textbook moving from point A to point B.
Right. Scholars suggest it operates as a spiral narrative. Think of it like a piece of music with a repeating chorus. Each cycle of 7s essentially revisits the exact same period of human history, but with increasing intensity and higher stakes each time. The camera resets, but the volume gets louder.
So it's not a straight line to the finish. It's more like a time loop that gets progressively more intense. And because it's this cyclical, highly symbolic text, people have developed 4 completely different lenses for reading it over the centuries.
And these lenses are crucial because they fundamentally change how people view the world around them.
I want to walk through these. First, our sources point to the idealist view,
which is the lens that says the book is purely allegorical.
Right, an ageless, timeless struggle between good and evil. No specific historical dates, no specific dictators, just the grand cosmic battle.
Then you have the preterist view. This one argues that the prophecies were mostly fulfilled way back in the 1st century.
Specifically with the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD by the Romans, right?
Exactly. So to a preterist, the intense world-ending language was referring to the end of that specific era and that specific temple system. The apocalypse, in this view, is essentially ancient history.
Which is a massive contrast to the third lens, the futurist view. This is the perspective that the vast majority of the book describes literal events that are waiting to happen at the very end of human history.
When you see a blockbuster movie about the end of the world, it is almost always pulling from this futurist interpretation.
And finally, there is the historicist view, which treats the book as a continuous coded map of Western church history.
In this view, you can plot specific historical events, like the fall of the Roman Empire or the French Revolution, right onto the prophecies.
And honestly, imagine the psychological comfort of that. If you're living through a terrifying war or a famine, having a map that says you are here and the good guys win eventually, that would be an incredible coping mechanism.
It provides total psychological security in a chaotic world. But what happens when people start using that map against you? What's fascinating here is a brilliant theological counter-move that happened during the Counter-Reformation.
Oh, the Jesuit pincer movement?
Yes. Protestant reformers were heavily using that historicist view to make a very specific, aggressive claim. They were arguing that the Pope was the literal Antichrist, right there in the biblical timeline.
That is a massive accusation to level at the most powerful institution in Europe. How did the church respond to that?
To shield the papacy from this attack, Jesuit scholars basically engineered a theological pincer movement. A scholar named Francisco Ribera championed the futurist view, pushing the Antichrist far into the distant sci-fi future.
Away from the present day.
Exactly. And at the same time, another scholar, Luis de Alcazar, developed the preterist view, pushing the Antichrist far back into the Roman past.
So they basically said, the bad guy is either ancient history or a distant future threat. But either way, it is absolutely not the Pope today.
It is a brilliant public relations move wrapped in theology. It effectively removed the papacy from the immediate apocalyptic crosshairs.
But let's step away from the scholars for a second, because it's one thing to debate the end of the world in a library. It's another thing entirely to wake up and feel like you are actually living through it. Let's travel back to the 14th century, specifically the year 1347, when the Black Death hit Europe.
Imagine living through a pandemic that wiped out 60 to 70% of some village populations.
The sheer scale of death was unimaginable, and the church at the time largely interpreted it as direct divine punishment for human sin.
The terror was absolute, and people reacted to that terror in profound ways. Our Ask Historians source highlights a truly revealing detail from the Crown of Aragon. Officials there actually cracked down on gambling and other vices.
Not just as a moral correction, though, right?
No, as what historians call an existential prophylaxis.
Wait, so their official public health policy for a deadly, highly contagious pandemic was to stop people from playing cards. I mean, I guess shutting down the taverns counts as early social distancing, but that shows just how desperately they were trying to appease God.
They genuinely believed that by lowering the circulation of sin in their community, they could appease divine wrath and literally stop the plague from spreading. It was a public health measure based entirely on apocalyptic theology.
But as you might expect, banning gambling didn't stop the fleas and the rats.
It did not. And when the plague kept spreading, the panic morphed into something much darker.
People started looking for someone to blame. They violently scapegoated marginalized groups, most tragically the Jewish populations across Europe. There were horrific mass executions based on absolutely baseless conspiracy theories that Jews were intentionally poisoning the wells to cause the plague.
In the midst of that horrific violence, Pope Clement VI actually stepped in. He issued official papal decrees, the bulls Sicut Judaeis and Quam vis perfidium Judaeorum, explicitly denying the Jews were causing the plague.
And his argument wasn't just theological, it was deeply logical.
He basically told the public, this plague is too massive, too widespread, and too catastrophic for any human being to engineer. It has to be a larger cosmic or divine event.
He used that raw logic to try and protect the Jewish population from further slaughter, pointing out that the plague was killing Jews and Christians alike. It's wild to think they blamed a literal plague on human sin and conspiracy.
The human need to find a culprit when the world feels like it's ending is incredibly strong.
But it makes you wonder if a catastrophic pandemic couldn't break the Western Church apart, what finally did. Because according to our sources, just a couple of centuries later, the apocalypse was being used as a literal weapon to split Christianity in half.
And that brings us to Martin Luther.
Right. I was looking at the Modern Reformation article in our stack, and I was surprised to read that Martin Luther didn't actually want to split the church at first. It looks like it was triggered by a few very specific events. Can you walk us through how something as bureaucratic as selling indulgences escalated into Luther calling the Pope the Antichrist?
It was a slow burn. It started with a monk named Johann Tetzel, who was aggressively selling indulgences. For those unfamiliar, this wasn't just a donation plate. This was literally selling pieces of paper that promised the forgiveness of sins or claimed to free your deceased relatives from purgatory.
Luther saw this as financially exploiting the poor.
Right. And when he protested, the papal theologian, Prierius, pushed back by claiming the Pope was completely infallible. Prierius stated the Pope could not be deposed even if he led multitudes to the devil.
Which is quite the hypothetical to throw out there during a debate.
It really escalated things. And the final straw was a historical forgery.
Ah, right.
Yes. A scholar named Lorenzo Valla proved that a crucial document called the Donation of Constantine, which the church used to claim supreme political power over Western Europe, was an absolute fake.
Those triggers pushed Luther to deeply examine his theology. His reasoning for finally labeling the papacy as the Antichrist was based on his belief that the Pope was actively usurping God's place.
Luther argued that the papacy was inventing rules that simply weren't in the Bible, like forbidding the clergy to marry.
He was outraged that the church denied the communion cup to the everyday lay people, reserving the wine only for the priests. And, most severely, he pointed to the church burning religious dissenters at the stake, people like John Huss and Girolamo Savonarola.
For Luther, persecuting people for trying to follow God's word was the ultimate proof of an apocalyptic enemy.
And Luther was a master communicator. He knew that dense theological papers wouldn't reach the peasants, so he used the newly invented printing press to spread this idea. He worked with famous artists like Lucas Cranach to create explicit woodcuts.
Basically 16th century viral memes.
Exactly. Memes that visually depicted the Pope alongside grotesque apocalyptic imagery. Now, we want to be incredibly clear to you as we discuss this. We are impartially reporting the historical facts from our sources. We are not taking sides in the Protestant Reformation, nor are we endorsing Luther's anti-Catholic views. Our goal is to show you exactly how apocalyptic imagery was weaponized to fundamentally fracture a society.
The historical context is essential for understanding how powerful that imagery is. But the way people identify the Antichrist has morphed significantly since Luther's day. We've moved from theological debates about church practices to pure geopolitical speculation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you look at modern evangelical speculation, it is practically a cottage industry to try and guess the exact identity of the Antichrist.
Oh, absolutely. Over the last century, authors and televangelists have pointed to figures like Mussolini, Hitler, various Soviet leaders, and even King Juan Carlos of Spain.
A lot of this modern speculation revolves around the idea of a future political tyrant, a slick, charismatic global leader who will miraculously sign a 7-year peace treaty in the Middle East, solve all the world's economic problems, and then suddenly show his true evil colors.
But if we look at the actual biblical text, that modern political picture directly contradicts what the original authors wrote.
The word Antichrist only appears in the Bible in the epistles of John. It's not actually in the book of Revelation at all.
And John is very specific. He writes that the Antichrist is already present in the first century. He explicitly says that there are many of them, not just one future supervillain waiting in the wings.
And most importantly, John defines an Antichrist purely by theology, specifically by heresy.
Right. To John, an Antichrist is simply anyone who denies that Jesus came in the flesh or denies the Trinity. It has absolutely nothing to do with building a powerful economic bloc, regulating currency, or signing Middle Eastern peace treaties.
So, if the biblical text says one thing, but modern believers deeply expect another, what happens when these incredibly specific, high-stakes prophecies simply don't come true?
That is where the psychology gets really fascinating.
I want to talk about the 1840s in the United States and a movement called the Millerites. A man named William Miller used intricate mathematical calculations based on biblical numbers to predict that Christ would return and the world would end in 1844.
Thousands of people completely bought in. Imagine the commitment. They sold their farms, they quit their jobs, they stopped planting crops, and they just waited.
And then the sun rose the next morning. 1844 passed. Nothing happened. It became known as the Great Disappointment. Imagine waking up that next day. You have no money, no farm, and the world is still here. How do you face your neighbors?
You might expect that everyone would just pack up, admit they made a massive mathematical error, and go back to normal life.
But human psychology simply doesn't work that way.
It doesn't. The shame and the ego blow are too vast. Instead of giving up, the movement fractured and radically reinterpreted the event. One group decided the event did happen, but it happened invisibly up in heaven rather than on earth.
That reinterpretation actually led to the founding of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Yes. And another thread of this disappointment eventually influenced a man named John Nelson Darby, who developed a theological framework called dispensationalism.
And dispensationalism is where we get a concept that is incredibly famous today, right? The rapture.
Exactly. Darby popularized the concept of the rapture, a sudden, unpredictable, secret removal of true believers from the earth before the worst of the apocalypse begins.
The brilliance of the rapture concept, psychologically speaking, is that it allows people to maintain the intense daily expectation of the end of the world without the risk of setting a specific date that could be proven wrong again.
It can happen at any second, so you always have to be ready, but you never have to face another 1844.
That incredible psychological pivot brings us to Leon Festinger's 1956 book, When Prophecy Fails. This is one of the most fascinating sources in our stack.
Festinger and his team of psychologists actually infiltrated a UFO doomsday cult led by a woman named Dorothy Martin.
She had convinced her followers that the world was going to be destroyed by a massive catastrophic flood on December 21st, 1954, but that a flying saucer would arrive at midnight to rescue her true believers.
So Festinger and his team are literally sitting there with him in Dorothy's living room on the night of December 21st. The clock is ticking toward midnight. The tension in that room must have been suffocating.
Midnight strikes. No flood, no aliens, no flying saucer, just silence.
This raises an important question about how our minds handle catastrophic failure. Festinger used this exact living room scene to articulate the theory of cognitive dissonance.
Think about a time you were absolutely certain you were right about something deeply important to you, and then the facts undeniably proved you wrong. It hurts, right? It physically feels uncomfortable.
That psychological pain is cognitive dissonance. When you hold a belief at the very core of your identity and evidence destroys it, people rarely say, "I was wrong, I guess I'm a fool."
Right, because admitting that means your entire worldview collapses. So what did Dorothy Martin's group do when the clock struck 12:05 a.m.?
They doubled down. After a few agonizing hours of silence, Dorothy Martin suddenly received a new message. She claimed that their intense faith, their dedication, and their prayers had actually convinced God to spare the planet.
They spiritualized the failure. They turned a massive predictive error into a spiritual victory.
And then, almost immediately, they started heavily proselytizing. They called the newspapers. Festinger realized a profound psychological truth. If you can convince others that your new rationalization is true, it socially validates your worldview and erases the psychological pain of being wrong. If I can get you to believe me, I must not be crazy.
It is a brilliant, almost desperate survival mechanism for the human ego. And what is so striking about our sources today is that we are still using those exact same coping mechanisms, but the prophecies have evolved.
We're no longer just looking at ancient religious texts. We are looking at modern secular data.
According to an April 2024 survey published by the Center for Political Studies, a staggering 39% of Americans believe humanity is currently living in the end times.
That is nearly 4 out of every 10 people you pass on the street. And the researcher who conducted that study developed an apocalyptic mindset scale that ranges from 0 to 1.
The average score across the entire sample was a very high 0.6.
But the most revealing part of the data, and this challenges a lot of assumptions, is who is scoring the highest. It is not just religious fundamentalists waiting for the rapture.
I found this part of the blog post absolutely wild. People who explicitly identify as non-Christian and irreligious are scoring incredibly high on this scale.
Why? Because they view secular threats through the exact same apocalyptic world-ending lens.
Whether the threat is catastrophic climate change, sudden nuclear war, or the unchecked godlike rise of artificial intelligence, the underlying psychological expectation of doom is identical.
It isn't just a concern for the future. It is an expectation of a sudden catastrophic end.
And we are even mapping the ancient, highly symbolic language directly onto our modern technological fears. Today, you have people genuinely arguing that artificial intelligence represents the image of the beast from the Book of Revelation.
A simulated consciousness demanding our allegiance.
Yes, and things like Neuralink or RFID microchips. Those are constantly compared to the mark of the beast, a technological system required to buy or sell in a doomed society. We are just pasting the old map onto new technology.
So what does this all mean?
Why does it matter if someone thinks the world is ending via a divine trumpet or a rogue AI?
Because it has a profound, measurable impact on how our society functions today. The Center for Political Studies data reveals a highly concerning real-world consequence.
Individuals who score high on that apocalyptic mindset scale show a 10% drop in their motivation to vote.
They are also significantly less likely to participate in any non-voting civic activities, like going to local town halls, attending rallies, or volunteering for campaigns.
It breeds total apathy. Because if you truly believe the ship is sinking and there is absolutely no way to stop it, why would you bother rearranging the deck chairs? Why vote for a new captain if the world is ending anyway?
Now, it is crucial for us to state that we are impartially reporting these political science findings. We aren't taking a partisan stance on climate policy, and we aren't lobbying for specific AI regulations.
But what the data clearly shows is that regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, accepting a bad outcome as inevitable fate actively diminishes our chances of actually finding a solution to the problem. Doom is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes clear that the impulse to see the end of the world in today's headlines is not a new phenomenon. It is a deeply ingrained human coping mechanism.
For thousands of years, whenever we face existential terror, uncontrollable disease, or rapid, confusing technological change, we instinctively reach for the apocalypse to make sense of the chaos. It gives a storyline to the suffering.
But by understanding why we do this, by recognizing the cognitive dissonance within ourselves and seeing the historical patterns of panic, we can actively choose to avoid the paralysis of political and social disengagement.
It is about recognizing the pattern so we aren't doomed to repeat it. And that brings us to a final thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. Think about Festinger's concept of cognitive dissonance. We have all these modern secular prophecies of doom right now, like the loud voices predicting the total, irreversible collapse of society via artificial intelligence within the next few years.
If those secular prophecies fail to materialize exactly as predicted, what will we do?
Will we gracefully adjust our worldview to reality, take a deep breath, and admit that things might actually be okay? Or will we, just like the UFO cults of the 1950s and the Millerites of the 1840s, simply double down on our panic, move the goalposts, and invent entirely new reasons to believe the end of the world is always just arriving tomorrow?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today. Stay curious, stay engaged, and we will see you next time.